Welcome back to Close Up. Steve Negron emerged as the winner from a busy Republican field in the primary. His goal now, unseat the incumbent and reclaim the CD2 seat for the GOP. Mr. Negron joins us this morning. And Steve, thanks for being here. We
Absolutely.
appreciate it.
Always good to be here.
So safe to say you won this primary among the Republicans on your conservative credentials and your strong conservative reputation at the State House. The second CD, though, used to be this kind of Yankee Republican territory. You see these more kind of moderate independent Republicans, even though that is really kind of on the way out. But are there any issues you can identify on which you would say you take a moderate stand?
Well, sure. I think what we just saw over the last week and a half, 2 weeks with the Kavanaugh issue, we were finding that there's a lot of people that are very uneasy by the way the government is going, specifically how they handle themselves in the hearings. You know, it's something that people are saying, you know, there is this dysfunction, and it really isn't necessarily issue-based, but it's a bigger picture. Is like, where are we going? You know, what have we done? What have we become? So that's what we're hearing right now, is that where is that level of modicum and civility? You know, you can agree to disagree, and that's okay. I think healthy debate is important, and that's how we've gotten some great legislation passed. But what we've seen is this, you know, this kind of this pack mentality, and people, Democrats and independents alike, are saying, you know, that's not what we stand for. That's not what we are as Americans, and that's something that they want to change. Hard to avoid that, though, if you end up going to Washington. It is, but you know, I think the situation is people all of a sudden say, you know, this is my ball, and if it's not my rules, I'm not playing here. You got to get rid of that. You know, I've said often, President Reagan used to say, if you agree with me 80% of the time, you're not my enemy. And I think we need to get back to a point that there are areas that we can agree on. You know, we talk about the debt. I think that that's something that everybody can come to an agreement on, and recognize that there is a problem with the debt. How do we fix it? Is where you get the work done. The opioid issue in our state is something that everybody agrees on. That's an issue. Then the nuances are, how do we get to the point where we can actually start fixing that things? So I think there's some larger issues that we all agree on. It's just when you get down into the worker area is where we have to find ourselves being collectively together. In the last two cycles, we've seen conservatives fall short against Annie Kuster, Marilyn Garcia, Jim Lawrence. Both ran solid races and didn't win. So what's your strategy to avoid their fate? Well, absolutely. Well, I think when you know, and both were great candidates, certainly, but I think I just come from a completely different perspective than do. I think I'm a candidate that is going to have some issues that Congresswoman Kuster has to get over. I am Hispanic. I am a small business owner. I am a veteran. I'm a state legislator. So I've come to this fight with a different perspective and a whole different avenues that I can bring to bear. And we're going to. I think my perspective of being somebody who's been involved in my community, very involved in my community, they see that that's somebody that is a representative, that is somebody that's not their voice, not a professional politician, and I think that's something that's going to resonate. And certainly Democrats like to talk about diversity, but the Republicans have been leading the charge in terms of congressional candidates. Absolutely. Without question. Your grandfather was a legal immigrant from Mexico. On the issue of immigration, there's been a lot of sharp rhetoric, particularly from the president himself here. You obviously support the president, but when he's referred to Mexicans in the past as drug dealers, rapists, criminals, bad hombres, does that ever make you question your support? No. What it does is that, you know, I think sometimes people take a line of thought and try to expand on that. Like, I don't believe that the president truly believes that every immigrant that comes in there is a criminal. We have criminal elements that are born here in this country, so that's not the issue. The issue is, I think he's trying to shine a light on, you know, we have a situation and a policy right now that makes it easier for some guys that aren't the best of breed to get in here. We need to make sure that we protect them from that and protect our citizens from that. Look, we have a national security policy, and there's 4 pillars to it. The first one is protect the American people. I mean, that's what he's trying to do. So I don't believe that he tried, and I never took it that way, that he was trying to label everybody. He was just trying to bring a focus that, look at some of these people that do come in. You know, we deport them and they come back in. That's really not the way that our immigration system should work. And there isn't a Democrat that I've talked to that says absolutely let back a known criminal in. You know, but we have to be able to make sure that we close those loopholes. But it isn't necessarily that everybody that's coming in is that type of person. Would you support legislation that would reduce the distance that ICE agents are able to set up these checkpoints, immigration checkpoints? For instance, Woodstock in New Hampshire on 93, they're able to do that because they can do it a certain number of miles from the border. There's been talk about reducing that. Would you support something like that? No, and you know, and I think that was Congresswoman Kuster that brought that out, and she just, you know, happily through a random stop was able to go see that these agents that are out there to protect us, that are out there to make sure that they enforce our laws. You know, if you say 25 miles or whatever, you don't think the element is going to know that? I mean, those are the kind of situations that I think we need to be very protective protective. And I think it's kind of interesting that, you know, we talk about from Congresswoman Custer that we want to beat the opioid crisis, and part of that and part of the equation is making sure we have law enforcement that's out there. So you can't say one hand, you know, reduce the ability of a law enforcement, yet I want to stop the opioid crisis. So those both have to go hand in hand.
We've seen some really volatile days in the market over this last week here, combined 1,000-point drop over a couple of days. Capitalism is all about that creative destruction, but we saw Wall Street almost destroy the U.S. economy in 2008. If we see a repeat again here, perhaps in the next year or so, do you believe that investment bankers should face consequences, real consequences, that they didn't face after the 2008 crash?
Absolutely. You know, when you look at the market always self-corrects, you know, and then everybody, I mean, I'm not a financier, but I know a little bit about, you know, that people run when they see this fluctuation. You know, this is the longest running bull market we've had in a long time. And when something dips, you know, people get very afraid, and maybe rightfully so because of what happened in 2008. But I think the market's going to correct itself. And also, anybody that does some things that's part of the problem, you know, nobody gets a free pass in my mind. And so if there are those people out there, investment bankers, that are doing something that have caused some things, then I think they should be held accountable.
Sticking with the economy, you're a Nashua guy, but you spent a lot of time up north through this campaign. Is there anything that Congress should be doing specifically to try and help the North Country?
Absolutely. I think part of it is, you know, I was talking to some people up there in Haverhill, and you can't make a 911 call up in Haverhill, you know, and so when you talk about having a state that is part of a larger entity within New Hampshire, and the second CD is specifically in the North Country, there are some things that are out there. You know, I've been told, I haven't seen it myself personally, that we got a $5 million grant to put in infrastructure, and what we ended up doing was giving somebody $5 million to do a study that says that you don't have cell phone connectivity. That's not the way it is. You know, I think if in fact the federal government is going to give money to a state, that there's clear objectives for that. You know, it isn't just a free-for-all, and I think that's part of the problem. We've seen when government gives money, they just give it without having any sort of understanding of what it's for. And I have a great relationship with the legislatures here, you know, and I have that relationship that I'd say, hey guys, you know, we could pick up the phone and work with each other. And I think that's the way. I need to be a resource for the state and the governor, for I can bring some money back to help the state.
Do you believe that Special Counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation is a witch hunt?
You know, not when I find that I've indicted 12 people, 12 Russians. To me, that then doesn't mean that it's a witch hunt. A witch hunt would be, I found nothing. But we did find some things. The witch hunt part of it is, you know, there was always some folks that believed that they were going to find some U.S. American citizen, some businessman that was trying to affect change to our outcome of our election. And we haven't seen that yet. But it is prolonged. You know, I think it's about time, if there isn't any legitimate reason to continue it, it's taxpayers' money that's funding this, then we need to either bring it to a close, move on, or bring some sort of indictment, which we haven't seen.
What do you think Mr. Trump was getting at when he said in July of 2016, Russia, if you're listening, I hope you can find the 30,000 missing emails, those Hillary Clinton emails? What do you think he was saying there?
Well, I think, you know, he reads papers just like everybody else, you know, and all of a sudden you see, you know, data bites that are out there that says, you know, we may have an opportunity to find all these emails. I think he was just trying to, as a feigned gesture, you know, if you have it, send it back to us. But we've forgotten about all that, what happened during the 2016 election. You know, there was a lot of clamor about, you know, the Democratic Party and what they've done. You know, nobody's above the law, Adam. And I don't care who you are or where you come from. And if there's something that's broken the law, then we should use every resource available. We use Interpol a lot of times to help us. So I think that's what I think he was trying to say. And you know, he's a gamesman. I mean, he puts things in place and see how they play out. So I think that's what he was trying to do. So
safe to say, if you're elected and you're there in 2019, we've already heard Rudy Giuliani say this election is going to be about impeachment.
Right.
That you're going to keep an open mind. That's
absolutely.
a possibility that you can consider.
Absolutely. You know, first of all, you know, I took an oath of office when I came into the active duty to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So if there's a situation out there that somebody, I don't care who it is, that has broken the law, I'm on the side of the law. That's exactly where I am all the time. And if we find some reason that somebody doesn't have to be the president or anybody else that's done some things illegal, then they're not above the law. You know, the Constitution applies to everybody equally. Then I would be in favor of doing that. But we haven't seen that. And saber rattling, I think, is just is harmful, and it just fans the flames of things that are out there. So if in fact something happened while I was in Congress and it came to light and I saw the evidence, then I certainly would side on the side of the law.
Okay, Representative Negron, we thank you for your time, and we'll see you out there on the campaign trail.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right.